Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me is Evan. Hello, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing? That
Oh,
was
not too bad. Not too bad.
that was such a firm how are you?
Yes. All
I was
right.
doing all right until I heard that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The schoolmaster
I know, right?
caught you doing something, asking how you are.
Yeah, right.
All right. So we are perhaps the firmness is because we're going to address. We talked last episode about how the story of Adam and Eve here, it requires you to make some choices in your
Mhm.
interpretation. Uh, Now we're going to address perhaps the biggest, yet certainly most. I don't actually consider it to be the biggest, which is where we'll end up at the end of this. But it certainly seems historically to be the biggest choice that you make surrounding this.
Mhm.
Definitely the most controversial choice you make surrounding this. And before we get into that question itself, I want to say that I think part of the reason this particular question is so important is I truly think a case can be made that this particular story, the story of Adam and Eve, is the most important story that humanity has told to each other. Uh, some would say, obviously, the story of Jesus, supersedes that. But in a way, the story of Jesus is dependent upon this story, right? This is there is no story of Jesus without the things that this story is trying to point out, right? Um, so this story is so foundational in terms of what is humanity and what is the place of humanity and why is humanity sort of what it is cosmically speaking, uh, that the questions surrounding it become very controversial and there are significant at points in history, there's been significant risk to individuals based on how they answer these questions. And the question that people have asked throughout the years is, what kind of story is this? Right?
Yeah.
Is it myth? Is it historical fact? Is it a condensed version of a larger tale? Is it allegory? Is it there's so many possibilities of what this is. Is it all of them at once? What kind of a story is it? How do we approach this? Right? Because there is so many ways, and it feels honestly like people have approached it every single way throughout the years.
Yeah.
But there has been at various times very strong orthodoxies surrounding this question in ways where the question was not really allowed to be posed. And those who did pose it sometimes had great potential risk, even potentially their lives, um, because of the claims of being a heretic and offering false teachings as a result of this. At the same time, though, there's some people for whom their answer changes over time. They see the story as one thing, as a myth, and then suddenly see it as historical fact, or the other way around, or they see it as historical fact and then as allegory, or vice versa. I think actually Augustine, who we discussed a little bit last episode, I think he went actually from this way of seeing it sort of first as kind of an allegory, and then seeing it as more historically true, an accounting of a historical event. So yeah, so let's make ourselves heretics to someone, right? Because no matter what, no matter how you answer this question, someone is going to consider you a heretic. So
Yeah.
in terms of the approach that we're going to take, I'm sure we'll be written off as heretics somewhere. So let's have at it.
We talked about a couple episodes about the importance of action rather than just sort of standing by and saying I'm just
mm,
not going to affect this. It's important to take the risk and actually uh, act on what you believe to be best.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so before we do that, though, I just want to say I think there's reasonable arguments and even some level of evidence on all sides of this perspective. right? For instance, there's some interesting genetic evidence to suggest the possibility of some type of a genealogical Adam and Eve, right? A coupling
Common
from which
ancestor.
much of humanity has sprung forth, right? At the same time, there's some pretty compelling arguments against that DNA evidence and against those ideas. So, given that I do see evidence on all sides, how do we approach it here, right? And the first thing I want to say is that I'm going to try and avoid the term literal. Uh, I I I don't like that word at all.
Why is that?
Well, so I find the word to be less clear and perhaps precise than people often assume it to be, right? For instance, I would say I take this story to be literally true, but the root of literal is literary, right? Where we also get literature from.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't change anything from fact or fiction, right? To say something is literally true or literarily true is it's sort of true within the story, right?
Yeah, more looking for historical.
Yeah, and I would say it's true, and I would say it's literally true in the sense that it absolutely reveals truth about the nature of human existence and our relationship with God, with the divine. I think all that is literally true about this story, but that doesn't necessarily mean I take it to be historical fact, nor does it mean I don't. The question of whether you see it as literally true, I don't think it provides accuracy in that sense, right? Because I would feel uncomfortable saying I don't see this story as literally true. But then if you say that to mean that I'm saying that it's historically true, well, then I feel like that's not quite accurate either. So that term as a whole, I think it does more of a disservice in this discussion than helping in any way. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that term? Have you given that much consideration at all, or what do you think? I guess of my qualms with it.
I don't know. I think it's just a matter of defining terms, and that's necessary when you're going forward in a discussion. I think it's that simple because I mean, the point of the word is to communicate an idea. And when people are saying literally true, they oftentimes mean that the physical events took place as written. And that's typically what people mean. But I think it's fair to say that the truth of something is different. I mean, it's to say that something, we're getting at the idea of can fiction be true? And it's like, well, not in the sense that maybe the events took place, but it can be true in that it can express something that is actually true. That seems to be what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And perhaps dividing up literally in that sense then seems to be just a point of emphasis, which I think is how people use it. Is it's literally true. They're trying to emphasize a point. That's how common usage goes. But I think dividing it up and saying, look, we're gonna remove the word literally, and we're gonna either speak to something being historically true, meaning that the physical events took place, or it can be true and not historically true.
Right.
I think that's fair, and I think that's a reasonable, that's a good expression of how of a choice that you can make in interpretation.
Okay, so there we go. So that word I'm going to set aside, right?
No more literally.
Yeah. No,
we're literally going to set it aside.
Exactly.
Sorry, I had to.
Yeah. So in general, I believe the question of whether this describes a historical moment in time, I think that question is irrelevant. And that's going to be the central premises, I guess, of my analysis here, is that I don't care whether this describes a moment in time, an actual event, because I don't think that matters in terms of what the story is expressing to us. And I will say too that I think that perhaps we talked last episode about the idea that maybe the sparseness of the story is not a defect, but the feature, right? It's meant to be there so that we can learn something about ourselves by the context that we give the story.
Mhm.
Maybe likewise the controversy around the historicity of the story
Mhm.
is meant for us to set aside that question. Maybe it's meant to have us say that shouldn't factor into your analysis. Your analysis shouldn't be dependent upon whether this describes a historical event or not, right?
Yeah.
It shouldn't, it simply shouldn't matter.
Or more so, why does it matter to you? I guess
That as well, yeah.
the question that arises immediately, and I think that is a an objection to this, reasonably so, is, well, if you get rid of the historicity of Adam and Eve, what prevents you from getting rid of the historicity of Noah? Okay, well then that. What if you get rid of the historicity of Abraham? Well then that. What if you get rid of the historicity of Jesus? I don't know. Does that
Okay.
cause? Does that line of thinking
So
track?
this yeah, this is a bit of a deviation, but we'll go down this road because I have given that thought, of course. And
I figured.
yeah. Okay, so the question of then the historicity of Jesus, for me, it actually comes down to one simple phrase, right? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one come to the Father but by me. To me, he claims capital T truth, right? That's what he claims to be there. And so for him to be capital T truth, he would have to be true in every conceivable way that that word could be interpreted, right? That's what the idea of capital T truth to me is, the kind of truth that knows no boundaries.
Well,
And therefore a historical truth would be necessary in addition to being, he is allegorically true or he is mythically true or whatever you would want to say, right? He is all of those truths. He's all of those truths wrapped up in one. So yeah, so I look at honestly the capital T truth thing, and that's why I think the most important question you answer in life is, do you believe that or not? Is he the capital T truth as well as the way and the life? Is that a yes or a no? Right? And if it's a no, then okay. But if your answer is yes, well then he must also be historically true. What I also take from that though, that's kind of interesting, I guess, is if he is capital T truth, and that is what Jesus is, then there's a kind of a way that everything that is not Jesus or God is not fully true, right? And in part, one of the things I could say is that, okay, well, us as humans, we sin, and and that is a way of being false, right? There's something false about sin. It's not aligned with truth. There's
mhm.
something about that is incorrect, right? And as we'll see at the end of Adam and Eve, our sin breaks the whole world and the whole process and everything, so everything else is sort of false because of that. But if Jesus is the capital T truth,
Mhm.
then, and if everything else is in a way false, right, and not that capital T truth, then I think you have some grounds, I guess, to look at the story of Adam and Eve and say, well, it doesn't have to be capital T truth because only Jesus is capital T truth. And so I don't know, does it have to be true in every single way? Like, no, necessarily everything that is not Jesus is in some way slightly false, right? And I don't know the exact way in which every single thing is false, but perhaps maybe one of the ways the story of Adam and Eve is false is that it is not an historic accounting of a particular moment, right, in exact perfect detail. Now how much does it vary from that? I don't know. It could vary in the fact that it's a summary of what actually happened, right? Perhaps the discussions were much longer and we're seeing a summarized version of the words that were shared. Perhaps it's only false in the sense that it anthropomorphizes God in a way, right? And God is obviously beyond humanity in the sense that he goes down and walks in the garden, right? He's clearly beyond that thing. Maybe that's the only way that it's false. Or maybe it's false in the sense that it doesn't it's not referencing a historical moment, right? Maybe that's the way in which it's false, or just at least not pure capital T truth. So yeah, I think there's room to explore in terms of that. And I think at the very least, there is the debate. And so the question to me is, can this story be relevant, I guess, without the answer to that question? And I think maybe that is the only way in which it's relevant, or fully relevant, or can be really, truly appreciated, is if we set that question aside. Because once we engage with that question, we begin to add things to the story that aren't there. We begin to infer things and see things in the story and add elements to it that aren't necessarily there. So to me, it seems best to set that question aside, right? And where I say, could it have happened? I don't know, maybe, sure, right? If it is something that happened, I personally would presume that it's largely a simplification of that tale. I don't think, frankly, Adam and Eve seem awfully foolish, almost like beyond the level of belief, in terms of being easily persuaded, and they are simpletons of unknown levels, right? If we take it to be fully historically accurate, right? But there you can see in that sense how my saying, okay, well, it did happen, but if it did happen, then I presume it's a simplification of I'm adding something to it now, right? By answering that question. So for me, I think the best approach is to just set that aside, that question. Now, I acknowledge that has some difficulty for people. In particular, there are, for some people, it's frankly going to sound insane that you can just set aside this question altogether. There are significant parts of Christendom that believe there must necessarily have been an historical Adam in order for the doctrine of original sin to hold. That's a bigger discussion, and one we're going to get into. So we're going to look at that more closely in a couple of episodes, but in order for that discussion to make sense, we're going to need to hit on another point of primary perspective for analysis of this story. So I want to review that first next episode, and then after that, we'll look at, okay, if you're going to say that question is relevant, how do you handle the doctrine of original sin? And I understand that that's obviously the biggest question that this perspective would take. So we will definitely get to that for sure. But I think it's thoughts or comments, I guess.
I think it's the biggest it relates theologically. The question that turns over in my head, well, before that, the first comment that I would make is that that perhaps in order to, we talked about broad applicability of this story last time, and the capability of allowing a story to be able to be of benefit and use to people, to humanity across geology, across cultures, across time. And it would seem that
I think you mean geography, maybe across geology too, right?
Maybe across geology. Yeah.
What type of three rocks have you built your foundation on?
That's pretty good. I like that.
Yeah, there you go.
There's some geology like PhD students who are going to get a T-shirt or something like that. This is the rock I build my foundation on. Anyways,
God says build your house upon the rock and not the sand. He doesn't specify which type, so you get to make that choice.
Exactly.
Right? Are you doing the igneous, the metamorphic,
or the sedimentary?
Okay, thank you. I took geology, by the way. I can never remember the three kinds.
Yeah, I took geology at
I
national parks, and it was
yeah, okay,
it wasn't great. I get sedimentary is the only one I always remember because it's
nice.
sediments.
Okay, it's
So
apparently the
between
one
the
I forget.
so between the two of us, we
Right.
got them down. We're ready to
Yes.
go.
Yes. I got an A
Uh,
in that class.
hey,
I
that's a
got an
good
A,
deal.
and I don't even remember the three rocks a decade on. So that tells you, I think, everything you need to know about
That
electives.
cost was a good deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but the necessity to have this broadly applicable is allowing it to be divorced of historical necessity. I think
Mhm.
is important for this story. But that what the question that comes up in my mind then is aside from the doctrine of original sin, why is it so viciously defended as being historical? That's what in the church, and I think there was a time and place where it's like, well, there's no reason to question it. It's only as modern
Well,
perspectives on hey, geology, we're going to come back
I
around
mean,
to.
but there were people questioning it within the first couple centuries of Christendom.
Yeah, but there's no compelling reason outside of it to say like, okay, well, there's no chance that this is there's no chance.
Materialistically, there wasn't, yeah, an absolute, there weren't things that needed addressing. Let's put it
Correct,
that way, right?
correct. And I think it's this. I think there's certainly a lot in the scientific community who are antagonistic to the church, but I think there are a lot in the church community who are antagonistic to science
Oh, for sure, yeah,
and
yeah,
who actively view science as antagonistic to them and don't
yes,
focus on the ideas that are different from it. So when I see this vicious defense of Adam and Eve being historical, it seems to be coming from a fear of science encroaching on yet another thing that the with in Christianity, and encroaching on it and taking it away from them. And it's like, well, that's then you have an improper view of science. It's like maybe there are people who are attacking you who have an improper view of it, but then you are holding an improper view as well.
I think that is the layman perspective of it,
Correct. That's
right?
why I think the doctrine of the original sin is probably the more nuanced one that takes place in seminaries. But
It's
I think
that,
to the
but there's
average
something else
person,
too, right? There's one other component I think that inspires the vicious defense of it, and that is, I saw this, for instance, there is this book right here. It just came out recently as we're recording this. It's called In Quest of the Historical Adam, by William Lane Craig. Yes. He,
mm-hmm.
I have yet to read the book. I plan to. It's obviously, third up in that row. Uh, we work from this way.
Is that
All
how
right.
the is
Yes.
that how
I
the
start there and go that way. All right. Yeah, we don't take the Hebrew approach and start here and work this way. So,
I didn't know you
um,
just stacked your books that way. I'm not that organized. I don't have them all. I don't
oh,
have
really?
them
No, I've got.
in a batting order ready to
Oh
go.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. The lineup is set. Although I will say, I come in and tweak the next batters all the time. So,
oh,
but
really?
for now, in theory, if I could read all the books at once, this is the order I would do that.
He's in the three spot.
Yeah, but I've read a couple of articles that he's posted related to this book coming out, and then responses and back and forth. And I will say that I think the critique I've seen of his perspective, which is where I don't think he takes he takes the approach, I think, that there is kind of a historical Adam, but not that they are the first humans. There is sort of like an evolutionary process of pre-humans and that kind of stuff that builds up to humanity. So trying to incorporate the scientific perspective with the biblical perspective. But he does take it that there is a historical Adam. Even that, though, is not enough for people. And the issue is
Correct.
that they look at that and say, well, if you don't take it to be historically true, you have to make interpretive choices, as we talked about. Now, again, my point would be, I don't know, I think you're making interpretive choices whether you realize it or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're adding things to it because you almost can't help but do that in a way. And so that to me is the biggest issue, is they see the not taking it to be a historical fact, as opening the door for interpretation that would be, incorrect or false or, not accurate. In some way. So that to me, along with, again, the point of the doctrine of original sin, which I said we'll get to in a couple episodes, but that to me is, I think, the biggest complaint I've seen, is that it's like, well, then how do you determine which, this by the way is of particular issue with his perspective, that there was a historical Adam but not the first humans. And so the question posed to him is like, hey, how do you know which things then you take as true in a historical sense and which things aren't? Mm-hmm. And there's this default to, it's better for us to just take it all as historically true, right?
It seems like these people fall into the camp of people who argue like fiction isn't that interesting because the author can just make whatever choice they want, which I've heard argued before, and saying like, that's why I only like to watch like documentaries, or only like to read books about things that are true events that happen, because that actually tells us what reality is about. And it goes along the same argument of fiction can't communicate some sort of truth to you. I think they would fall into that camp potentially and say like, well, if this isn't an exact historical retelling of what actually happened, then it's not true. Then a historical truth is the only truth.
It is. I think it is similar thinking. I'm going to go a step even further with that, and we've talked a lot here about the ideas of the spiritual, the functional, and the materialistic. Right. That was somewhere in our first 6 episodes or whatever. Yeah. We had an episode on that. We'll link it in the show notes. But that, honestly, that thinking, we talked about the foolishness of deriving your understanding of things from the materialistic.
Direct material thinking.
Yeah, because no, it's the spiritual that creates the functional, from how the material should be used, right? Everything is dependent upon the spiritual truth. And to me, claiming that, well, this has to be historically true, you're now setting the foundation of your theology on material truth. And that's not the right approach. Your foundation needs to be on spiritual truth. That is where the foundation of your theology should begin from, is what is the spiritual truth,
That's why they have an incorrect view of science.
Yeah, and that's why
there's a fundamentally,
and that is why, to me, then perhaps the fact that there is controversy surrounding us is the reason our analysis should set that issue aside and not even bother with it. And our theological approach should begin from the idea that, well, it doesn't matter whether this is historically true or not. There is a way in which this is true, absolutely, and share some truth. So what is that? What can we take from that? And like I said, we'll deal with original sin in a couple episodes. Our next episode, though, there is one element that we need to examine before that, and we're gonna relate this back to our discussion of Genesis 1 and the first story of the Bible, and let's look at how these two stories mix together. Because that is, again, one of the largest choices that must be made around this story. And then with that in mind, I think we can have a more interesting, valuable discussion of the doctrine of original sin. So until then, subscribe so that you don't miss out on an episode. And, if you want to call us heretics, feel free to do that in the comments below. And, shoot us an email at unschooledtheology@protonmail.com. And we'll see you then.